He came from poverty and illness in India and was declared the new Messiah, groomed to bring salvation to the world. As a boy, he became the symbol of a new spiritual movement and spoke to those weary of social strife, religious dogma, and materialism. But as a man, Jiddu Krishnamurti defied the expectations of those around him. And when he found his own voice, he didn't offer salvation.
What we are trying in all these discussions and talks here is to see if we cannot radically bring about a transformation of the mind. Not accept things as they are, but to understand it, to go into it, to examine it, give your heart and your mind with everything that you have to find out, a way of living differently.
He was a towering figure on the platform, and with audiences, sometimes as though they were hypnotized by him, absorbed in what he was saying.
But that depends on you and not somebody else. Because in this there is no teacher, no pupil, there is no leader.
He's talking about something you do yourself on your own, and everybody kept looking at him as a messiah or a world teacher, somebody who would save them.
He wanted people to wake up to the reality of something and not simply have faith and trust that some outside entity was going to provide the answers.
To the crowds who had come to him looking for salvation, he offered both less and more. The Adyar River winds its way through southern India. At the turn of the century, wildlife teemed its banks and small villages dotted its shores. One of the largest of these towns, named after the river itself, was where Jiddu Krishnamurti spent part of his childhood. His father had moved his family to Adyar after the death of Krishnamurti's mother. Here he found a small house to raise his 4 sons and work with a religious organization he had joined, the Theosophical Society. As a young boy, Krishnamurti played along the banks of the river in the shadow of the imposing Theosophical headquarters. The Theosophical Society, a spiritual movement founded by Westerners, promoted universal brotherhood and explored ancient religious traditions. They had selected Adyar as their home.
For people who are brought up in the West, India becomes seen as a new Holy Land. For a spiritual seeker, India is sort of a gold mine.
Theosophy was an attempt to bring an amalgam of the great religious, spiritual teachings of the world together and offer them in a palatable form.
Who was interested in it? Everybody, almost, on some vague level. Secret wisdom is very attractive to most people, at least on a superficial level.
It mainly attracted people, I think, who are willing to think outside the box, okay, to think unconventionally, definitely.
Annie Besant, the president of the Theosophical Society, was particularly drawn to mystical elements of the movement. She and other theosophists became convinced that a Messiah, a world teacher, would come from the East, possibly from India, to lead humanity to enlightenment. Walking along the river in Adyar one day, Charles Leadbeater, a colleague of Besant's, happened upon a group of boys playing along the shore. One of these boys was 14-year-old Jiddu Krishnamurti. To the casual observer, nothing about the boy appeared remarkable.
Leadbeater saw a scrawny, malnourished young boy who had crooked teeth, lice in his eyebrows, who was not very strong or healthy. He looked a typical South Indian Brahmin boy.
Leadbeater was a controversial figure. He'd been brought up on charges of immoral conduct in England, and though he was never convicted, many theosophists doubted his character. Despite this, Annie Besant trusted and relied on Leadbeater, and she defended his innocence. She also thought him to be clairvoyant, able to see the atmosphere that surrounded a person. This aura, they both believed, could reveal the purity of a person's soul.
Mr. Leadbeater said that child has the purest aura.
An aura that was very beautiful.
Most innocent aura that he'd ever seen.
This caused him to identify this boy as being someone extraordinary.
That should be taken and nurtured. That's what started this whole story.
From this brief encounter, Leadbeater declared Krishnamurti to be the one and told Theosophists to prepare for the coming of the Lord. Theosophists believed this unlikely 14-year-old would lead the world towards peace and spiritual salvation. And they thought themselves to be following in the path of religious tradition and prophecy, wherein the world teacher would once again be reincarnated, as he had been in the form of the Buddha, in the form of Jesus and Muhammad.
Theosophists draw from many sources, but feel that the world teacher may well be a figure that will be independent of any one religion, will sort of combine and transcend them all.
Besant and Leadbeater contacted Krishnamurti's widowed father and sought permission to move his son onto the grounds of the Theosophical headquarters. But the boy spoke no English and was terrified of foreigners. His father and he agreed only after Krishnamurti's younger brother, Nitya, was allowed to go with him.
At the very beginning, it was simply a task of helping him to learn to sleep in a bed, to use a toothbrush, to eat with fork and spoon. So these were kind of superficial cultural things that Besant and Leadbeater thought were necessary to make him comfortable in the world.
From now on, Krishnamurti and Nitya's lives would never be the same. The boys were constantly observed and strictly controlled. Their food was carefully selected, and they were put on a regular schedule of meditation, exercise, and study.
He would have preferred to sit and look at the clouds, to watch running water, to look at flowers and insects. He did not like to study books. So his mind was not the kind of a mind that was traditionally educable.
Years later, Krishnamurti looked back on his childhood, able to reflect on those experiences. He referred to himself as K and spoke about himself in the third person.
Nobody was to touch anything that K touched. If they said they liked oranges, for the rest of the year they had oranges. If they said they wanted to go on a bicycle ride, right, you went on a bicycle ride for the rest of the year from 7 to 8. So the boys never said after that they liked anything.
After several months, Besant and Leadbeater decided that Krishnamurti was ready for the next phase of his spiritual initiation. They placed him in a room and encouraged him to enter a trance-like state. Soon, they believed, he would be contacted by what they called the Masters.
Theosophists were convinced that there were disembodied masters that spoke to people through various means, and that somehow this contained some unutterable type of wisdom not obtainable through other sources.
The immediate background of Theosophy has to be seen as the spiritualist movement of the mid-19th century, the belief that mediums could communicate messages from departed relatives and loved ones, or in some cases from higher spiritual teachers.
Besant and Leadbeater said that at some point Krishnamurti's consciousness would leave his body and a fragment of the consciousness of the world teacher would step in. In a sense, it's a kind of mediumship that they were talking about, where the host becomes unconscious and another spirit steps in.
Krishnamurti participated in these rituals without question, but his father had growing concerns. He didn't trust Charles Leadbeater. In an effort to address his fears, Annie Besant moved to adopt both boys. She alone would be responsible for their care and education. Though resistant, Krishnamurti's father ultimately complied. He recognized that the Theosophists were offering his sons an opportunity that went well beyond what he could ever hope to provide. After 3 years, Besant decided it was time to continue Krishnamurti's education in England. So outfitted in his first European suit and wearing his first pair of leather-soled shoes, he boarded a ship for Europe. He would not see India or his father again for nearly 9 years. As his train pulled into Charing Cross Station, Krishnamurti peered at the crowd, terrified. Having spent his life robed and barefoot, he felt awkward in Western clothes and his shoes were painful. The London that greeted Krishnamurti was in the midst of radical change. By the early 20th century, streetcars replaced horse-drawn carriages and electricity transformed the workplace and the home. In a world where science and industry increasingly shaped everyday life, many in the West sought to reconnect with deeper spiritual meaning.
Science left a lot of people cold because it seemed to suggest that the universe, and therefore we as creatures in it, are nothing but sort of mechanical automatons. On the other hand, there was a lot of mistrust of religion because it was still, by and large, with some exceptions, pretty fundamentalist conservative.
Spiritual seekers flocked to new movements like Theosophy, which embraced both scientific progress and religious beliefs. And they were particularly drawn to traditions and people from the East, who seemed to them to have greater spiritual wisdom. But not everyone greeted Krishnamurti with open arms.
As I go about the street, they point me out. There goes that chap printed in the papers, the Messiah. Then they burst out laughing. Oh, how I hate it all. And I shall have it all my life. Lord, what have I done to deserve all this?
Despite his unease, Krishnamurti tolerated the Theosophists' efforts to transform him into a proper young gentleman. For nearly a decade, he and his brother lived privileged lives. Their clothing and food were first class. They summered throughout Europe and were given a castle in Holland. But as much as Krishnamurti was welcomed by the upper class, he felt himself an outsider. He began to establish his own opinions and his own voice.
When I went to Europe for the first time, I saw how people amused themselves trying to forget their unhappiness, thinking that they were solving their problems by drugging their hearts and minds with superficial excitement.
Annie Besant had surrounded him with assistants, secretaries, and tutors, and Krishnamurti rarely had time alone. He lived a luxurious life, but he was denied the one luxury most important to him: privacy.
I dream and dream of a different life. There is a rebellion within me, surging quietly but surely. To what purpose, I don't know. I would like to weep a good long weep. I want to go away, away from everybody to some beautiful, cool, secluded spot.
On a trip to the United States in 1922, he and his brother found that solitude. They were given a small house in the Ojai Valley of Southern California.
Ojai was a special place where he could relax. He didn't have to dress up for the press. He picked oranges. He milked the cows, made cheese. He was very comfortable in Ojai. It was his home.
He would glow with the delight of seeing clouds, the sky, trees. He loved trees. He loved nature and he loved this valley tremendously.
But Krishnamurti's time in Ojai was limited. Theosophists expected him to participate in all their events and functions, where he delivered their message of a coming new civilization. By the mid-1920s, the once shy and awkward teenager had grown into a mature and sophisticated young man and a magnetic public speaker.
People throughout the world are seeking comfort, but not understanding. And as long as they seek comfort, they will never find spiritual comfort, because behind it there is no true understanding of life.
He had a kind of vitalizing impact. It brought it an awful lot of attention in the media, some of it slightly supercilious. You know, I've seen articles from the 20s, Messiah in tennis shoes and that sort of thing, concerning Krishnamurti. But nonetheless, you know, they were talking about him, they were talking about the movement.
A lot of people are looking for religion that suits what they want, so they listen to him. I don't think there was a huge amount of either ridicule or adulation. I think that he got a little of both, just like every other teacher.
In order to help coordinate Krishnamurti's life, the Theosophists created a separate organization, the Order of the Star in the East. Members of the order were issued special badges and distinctive robes, and a magazine kept track of Krishnamurti's activities. Later, writing in the third person, he again looked back on this period of his life.
They had put him at the head of an organization where he was literally worshipped, and he used to shrink from all that. He would tell everybody, "I'll do whatever you want." That used to be his favorite phrase.
Still, Krishnamurti hid his dislike of all the pomp and ritual that surrounded him. He was devoted to Annie Besant and didn't want to disappoint her.
He always spoke of Annie Besant with the greatest affection. He would say, Amma did this, and Amma said this. Amma, of course, being the Indian word for mother. So there was the greatest affection all his life.
But through it all, his main source of support had been his brother, Nitya. Since their days as boys in Adyar, the two had rarely been apart. On the eve of the Theosophical Society's 50th anniversary, Nitya fell ill with tuberculosis, and Krishnamurti at first refused to leave his brother's side. But the Theosophists persuaded him that they had divine awareness. They said they knew that nothing would ever happen to Nitya. So in late September 1925, Krishnamurti left for India.
He took this trip to India, and the telegram arrived in the Suez Canal that the brother had died here in Ojai.
That was, I think, the great tragedy in Krishnamurti's life. I think his brother was the closest human being to him.
This shook Krishnamurti deeply, not only the death of the brother, but also the fact that he could not rely on the leaders of the Theosophical Society to predict anything seriously. Between the Suez Canal and Bombay, Krishnamurti went through a deep transformation, which seemed to shake the very roots of his relationship with Theosophy. He felt he could not trust these authorities any longer. Not just particular people, but the effect of authority on the mind. And when he arrived, he was a different person.
Krishnamurti now began taking a hard look at the organization that surrounded him and the audiences who gathered to hear him speak. He realized he'd become a mere figurehead surrounded by a crowd of followers and acolytes.
I was in revolt against Theosophists, with all their jargon, their theories, their meetings, and their explanations of life. I questioned everything because I wanted to find out for myself.
This was part of Krishnamurti's process of growing up and becoming an independent teacher. He told a friend, "I don't give a damn about the world teacher." And he wondered why they had picked him.
It had been 20 years since the Theosophists had plucked him from obscurity and thrust him onto the world stage. Now, at 34, Krishnamurti decided to stop performing a role he no longer believed in. On August 3, 1929, using poetic yet powerful language, he gave a speech that would forever change his life.
I maintain that truth is a pathless land and cannot be approached by any path whatsoever, by any religion, by any sect.
Before several thousand theosophists, he dissolved the Order of the Star in the East and announced that he now wanted no followers.
A belief being purely an individual matter. You cannot, and therefore must not organize it. If you do, it becomes crystallized, dead. It becomes a creed, a sect, a religion to be imposed on others.
He said, you have to find out for yourself what is truth. You cannot rely on me. They weren't expecting this. They were expecting salvation. He didn't provide salvation. He provided doubt, skepticism, and the tools for looking within.
Theosophists were devastated. Everyone felt abandoned, lost without Krishnamurti's spiritual leadership.
I've heard old-time theosophists from that time speak of how it was sort of like the waking up from a dream, you know, the destruction of something that had been very precious in your life and kind of floundering around, you know, where do we go from here?
Although his future was now uncertain, Krishnamurti stood firm. He walked away from his life of privilege, returned to the estates, and retreated to his small house in California. Since the age of 14, his days had been organized and scheduled by the theosophists. Now, for the first time in his adult life, Krishnamurti was free to make his own choices. And he made it clear that he was not the world teacher, not the Messiah. Still, thousands came to hear him speak.
He taught some things that were uncomfortable for the theosophists. He said that the whole emphasis on reincarnation was misguided and irrelevant. The whole business of masters is truly irrelevant from his perspective.
He now stressed that it was his message that was important and that he, as the messenger, was irrelevant. He took the skills he had learned as an orator with the theosophists and applied them to his own message. And for more than 50 years, Krishnamurti traveled the world, encouraging his audiences to abandon religious dogma and find their own answers.
A religious life implies being a light to yourself, which means no outside authority, no spiritual authority, including me.
People asked him, what should I believe? How should I behave? And he mirrored that back by saying, what do you see? He was saying the enlightenment is for you to discover, not for me to give to you.
From the 1960s on, Krishnamurti devoted much of his time and energy to the creation of schools around the world that stress spiritual and creative exploration, as well as intellectual growth.
He founded a school in which the main object, they claim, is to have people think for themselves. Well, you can't give a greater gift than that to the whole process of education.
The educator is the greatest individual on earth because he's bringing up children for the future. Therefore, they are much more important than the politicians, than the religious leaders and priests and the business people and all the rest of it. It's a sacred profession.
In 1986, at the age of 90, Jiddu Krishnamurti died at his home in Ojai. He left behind more than 40 volumes of his writings, thousands of hours of audio and video recordings, as well as foundations and schools that help protect and spread his message.
I would have to say that his legacy, at least among ordinary people, is rather slight. Now, that doesn't mean that he isn't important in more subtle ways. All of the great prophets had something to give to the world. They all had wisdom, and of course it's up to the world to listen to what they have to say.
Once when asked, what are you leaving behind, Krishnamurti said, you can burn the books, you can destroy the tapes. If there are not people who have understood what I have been talking about, then there is nothing.
In this, there is no teacher, no pupil. There is no leader. There is no guru. There is no master, no savior. You yourself are the teacher and the pupil. You are the master, you are the guru, you are the leader. You are everything.